Right. Good evening and welcome to the Healthy Debate. My name is Lindy Naughton. On this show, we're committed to encouraging and promoting debate on topics relating to health, with a wide variety of guests from all sectors of Irish life. The material you will hear on these programmes is not available on the mainstream media, so show your support for us by clicking on the share button, which should be on your screen now. This evening we have two special guests, both of them doctors, one from Dublin, Professor Bill Tormey, and one from Germany, from Hamburg, Dr. Walter Weber. But first of all, before we get down to the chat, we'll have a look at what's been happening over the last few days. Today's top story was that a 90-year-old woman who happened to be Irish was the first woman to get the coronavirus vaccine in the UK. In my opinion, there's so much wrong with this story, it's quite difficult to know where to begin. The second person, allegedly, was a gentleman called William Shakespeare. Truly, you could not make it up, and I'm wondering whether somebody did. But that's according to the mainstream media again. Lockdown fans continue their attempts to undermine Sweden's success in dealing with this so-called pandemic without resort to the drastic measures that have been taken elsewhere. The fact is that based on population and other factors, Sweden has done no better or no worse than countries that impose strict lockdowns, mask mandates, and so on. That is the point of Sweden's story. Lockdowns make no difference. It's not that they're better than us, it's just that they've done it differently. In Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon has published a COVID-19 etiquette guide on, among other things, how to handle awkward situations and what to say to avoid causing offence if, for instance, somebody wants to give you a hug. You can just imagine how it's been greeted in areas such as the Gorbals of Glasgow and Craighour in Edinburgh, a place I know well. There's lots of talk about vaccines. Some think that it's the magic bullet that will end lockdowns, physical distancing and face coverings. Others are sceptical, pointing out for a start that the vaccine hasn't been gone through the usual rigorous testing procedures. Others are just pointing out that a lot of us by now are probably immune, that we either had coronavirus without knowing it or we had some other version of coronavirus, such as a cold. All this, by the way, is for a virus which, although very infectious, is not particularly deadly, but we'll discuss this with our guests later. Here in Ireland, we still have the daily bulletin from the pulpit known as NEFIT, though whether anyone is listening anymore is open to question. One man, that brings us neatly on to one man here, who's been highly critical of NEFIT. That's Professor Bill Tormey. And the first question we'll ask Bill is what his position is on NEFIT at this stage, or how he thinks they're doing.
NEFIT is fundamentally a good idea to get people who are slightly more knowledgeable. Let's not call them experts, because I think expert is the most prostituted word in the English language at the moment. But let's say that they know more than the average guy in the street does about certain things. And you have people trained in public health who have a fair idea about some things, not everything. It is a good idea for that to happen. However, the purpose in a democracy is for the government to govern. And when you get a situation where a public servant whose activity is mediocre at best takes over the running of the country and issues edicts right, left and centre every day on the 6 o'clock news, which is the main news, Dr. Weber, in Ireland on television. This guy appears like an Indian chief and issues a whole lot of edicts right, left and centre, and then patronises the semi-intelligent section of the population for the next 23 and a half hours until he comes on again and says something else. So that's what's been going on. These people, Dr. Weber, believe it or not, at the beginning obviously didn't read the reports from the Chinese CDC published on the 17th of February, and I think they were in the Lancet. That was in the Lancet, and the reports from Lombardy in Italy about who was dying and why and how from coronavirus, or COVID-19 as it then became. And It seems that we're now in a shocking mess because the Irish government never had a policy explicitly. And what they tried to do at the beginning was reduce the number of cases. And that was successful in this country by lockdowns and by hand washing and social distancing, etc. The comedy act of this crowd was that they followed the WHO in relation to masking very early on. And I did a TV program, a radio program, and newspaper stuff saying that this was a respiratory virus, which is a variation of SARS, and it's also a variation of all the the coronaviruses that are regular, causing winter colds and flus and things like that. And they didn't notice that actually respiratory viruses are reduced by wearing a mask. And what it does is it reduces the spray from the people who are infected. It doesn't stop you getting infected. What it does is reduces the infectivity of you, if you're infected, for the rest of the people around you at any given point. And that's shown by various media stuff from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and other data. However, they ignored it here. They even went so far, believe it or not, Dr. Weber, they put a guy who's professor of microbiology in Galway University Medical School on the television, on the prime time program on television, to say that masking could make things worse and that we shouldn't be masking at all. And then he demonstrated how to mask properly. The whole thing was comedy, just straight up comedy. And that was reversed in due course. And now they have a situation where they're considering masking the population walking around in a street. So in other words, they've gone from the absurd to now the ridiculous. And it's a hop, step, and a triple jump in between. It's been really funny. In relation to what's been going on, this guy, the chief medical officer, Holohan, then decided that his wife was ill, which is very unfortunate. She is ill, very unfortunate. And he would take time off to be with his wife. So he takes time off a number of weeks. And he decides that he's going to come back 2 days early and chair this public health group, National Public Health Group, of experts, I hasten to add, mainly public servants from the Health Service Executive and other bureaucrats. But anyway, he was going to come back, and he announces when he comes back that the whole country had to go into level 5 because otherwise it was hellfire and damnation. The nation was going to descend into perdition. So this guy went from a level 3, which is doable, to a level 5. And what happened? They closed all the social areas like pubs and stuff like that. They kept them tightly closed. They then told people not to be going into their houses, not to be doing this, that, and the other. And the traffic in Dublin showed that the comparison between the first lockdown, which was April approximately, and the next lockdown at level 5 was no comparison. The population at large ignored what was going on because the traffic showed that loud and clear. So here we have a situation where it's coming up to Christmas, and the deputy leader of the government announced that the NFET, that's what they call themselves, the National Public Health Emergency Team, didn't really consider the consequences. So what they did was they announced a major socio-biological experiment, which is lockdown. But they didn't do what anybody involved in biology would do, which is you look for side effects. If you introduce a new drug in Germany, you have to list, you're by law required to list every side effect. So in other words, unless you're talking about homeopathy, every drug you use if it has any effect at all, has side effects. There isn't a drug around that will do something that eureka, that's all it does. It does other things as well, or it won't work. And that's a basis of biological pharmacology, as you know very well. So what did they do? They ignored it all. And then it got to the stage where the effect on the economy of yo-yoing, because the government had a choice. They either got rid of this thing all out of the country, which meant testing at ports and airports, and also doing a deal with the lunatic fringe that run Northern Ireland, and doing a port and airport deal with them, so that there was a contiguous, an identical policy in relation to COVID on all parts of the island of Ireland. As you know, the British are in occupation in Northern Ireland, so they had Boris Johnson and all the mad stuff going on, and they persisted with this. Ironically enough, in the north, they have a very sensible unionist Minister for Health, Robin Swan, who's, I think, doing a good job despite the vicissitudes of both the DUP and Sinn Féin. But they're not able to do what they want to do. So in answer to Lindy's question was, what do I think of NFET? I called for NFET to be dissolved in the middle of the summer because they entirely missed the opportunity to test, and identify, isolate, and quarantine, which is what they did in Iceland. If you read the publication in Nature on the 26th of November of this year, which is a few weeks ago, it detailed with great aplomb what exactly happened in Iceland and how they got rid of the virus in Iceland. And I'll give Lindy this when I'm leaving it because it's very informative. But the principle of what they did in Iceland was they decided that anybody with a sniffy cold or anything else had to be tested. And the government organised a private company, Genomic Medicine Ireland. It's not, I can't remember what it's called in Iceland, but it's a private American-based company. And they did the fingerprint gene on every patient who had a positive. So they knew where the virus was coming from. And it was coming from people going on skiing holidays or going to Spain. So, and they did another, and what they did is they randomly tested, or they didn't random, they just tested 1,000 and I think about 2,000 people, and they found that when they looked at a detailed medical history from each of the people that was tested, they found that of those people who were tested, about 16% of them had asymptomatic, had positive COVID PCR testing. They looked at those 16% and what they actually said were their symptoms, and they found that 40-something% of those who were positive had no symptoms. So if that's the case, you basically can only eliminate this by testing. And they were able to do that because they were on a big island.
Yeah, but the testing, I don't know if I agree with you about that.
Well, it's not whether I agree. That's
No,
those, as they say, are the facts.
No, but what I'm saying is, what you're saying, did they actually test people? You said people with sniffles.
They did.
Did they test people who had no symptoms?
They did a study first,
right,
and they found that people who had a positive, that 46% of them had no symptoms. So what they tried to do, they succeeded in eliminating the virus off Iceland, and it came back about 3 months later, and they went pounced. They isolated everybody who was in contact with the person who tested positive. They checked the gene fingerprint of the coronavirus, COVID-19, in those particular people.
But using a test that, well, since PCR is not accurate, were they using?
Hold on, PCR is as good as you're going to get. The bottom line is that PCR will give you false positives if you do too many multiplications. In other words, if you multiply it up by more than 30 cycles, you're going to get false positives. But if somebody comes in with a positive at 20 cycles, it's positive.
It's positive for what?
For whatever, for coronavirus.
What kind of coronavirus?
Whatever the coronavirus is that the what do you call it? That the pieces of the PCR test are actually isolating. That's what is positive. So in other words, if it's the genome, it's positive for that. If it's an envelope protein, it's positive for that. If it's it depends what they're looking at. In other words, you have the RFLPs, the restriction fragment length polymorphisms, and you can isolate bits of this virus and test for those specifically.
Okay. Right.
So in other words, it's kind of quite complicated, really, but it's much better than the naysayers are actually saying. The problem in Ireland is chaos at governmental level, and NFET, who don't tell you the truth. We had the so-called clinical director of HSE telling people when there was a huge outbreak, which the HSE missed entirely in the nursing homes where half the deaths were. They had this guy, Colm Henry, say the best place for the elderly was in the nursing homes. Oh, hello. My God.
Can I ask you something a bit
Yeah.
controversial?
I
That
know what
heard?
I do with him. I give him a train ticket one way back to Cork. Good luck, pal. While you're at it, and here's your pay
Anti-Cork
hub.
bias there. Here's a question.
No, that's where he lives. It's not an anti-Cork bias. The most spectacular CV of anybody in the medical game in Ireland is in UCC.
Right.
Fergus Shanahan. So I ain't anti-Cork.
Okay. No, but here's a question. It was
Yes,
put to
Lindy.
me, and I do not know if it's true. Somebody said to me that one of the things the HSE has ignored is that when the stories about this virus started to come out, that what the nursing homes did was that they got rid of all their more frail patients or customers or whatever you like to call them, and dumped them on the hospitals. The story I had heard before this was that the hospitals told the nursing homes to take back their ill and frail patients, who then went into the nursing homes, got sick, and infected everyone. Do you know anything about that?
I do, yeah, not quite. That's
Yeah,
a bowdlerised version of what actually happened.
right.
What happened was that the elderly were going in and out of hospitals anyway because they
Okay.
were the elderly who were particularly sick with various morbidities. And what happened is the hospitals were suddenly emptied out when this started last March.
Right.
And Beaumont, and it was taken over by COVID. And the maximum number of people in the hospital that I work in was 155 COVID persons at peak. In
Right.
Blanchardstown, it was 54 people were in there out of 100 and something beds. The outpatients was closed down. There were no cancer patients being operated on. There was everything more or less stopped.
Right.
And to the extent that the British National Statistical Office found that the number of people who dropped dead from heart disease at home or in the street increased by 55% from in this year up to the end of October, which shows you that people did not go to hospital with the normal morbidities, and the trolley crisis, i.e. Professor Weber, the number of people hanging around in A&E on trolleys, supposedly sick, disappeared. So that brings you into that obviously begs the question: one, how many of them in the past were appropriate? Two, what was it that the nurses in this country were the Irish Nurses Organisation was sending out the figures every week. The fact that we have nearly the highest number of nurses per patient in Europe in this country. In other words, you're right about the misinformation that floats around.
Yeah.
We go with a huge amount of propaganda. And we have a very high level of investment in the health service by the government here. The total money spent between public and private here is very high. And the best system was set up, in my opinion, by Bismarck in, was it 1870 something? Would that be right, Dr. Weber? Bismarck would set up the German insurance system. Do you remember that? He's the guy who set that up. So it would be very interesting to see what we could do with that, because one of the ways of dealing with public and private medicine in this country is very simple. Pay the doctors the same for seeing all patients.
Yeah.
And if they see nobody, good luck. See you in
So before we have a word with Dr. Weber about the German situation, what do you feel? You know, we've mentioned NEFIT, but what about the HSE? Does
Yeah, what about them? Yeah.
Where does the responsibility stop? I suppose is
The
what
responsibility stops where the buck stops here, as the American president who was going to bomb the Japan with an A-bomb said, Harry Truman. The buck stops here. It stops at Donald Trump. The bottom line is it stops here with the Taoiseach. That's the bottom line. And if they follow, they had the boy wonder as Minister for Health, Simon Harris, who followed every comma and every full stop of every sentence that NFET said, and said how wonderful they were. And he had the cheek to go on saying anybody who called him into question was basically anti-national. So I'm anti-national, am I? You must be having a laugh here, pal. You know, I can tell you one thing: the only hospitals I've ever worked at in this country are all public. Blanchardstown, Beaumont, and now Drogheda as well. They're all public, Lindy. I don't work in. I'm not in the money game. I get well paid, seriously well paid, but I'm not in the game of private hospitals. And one of the reasons we have a problem here is we don't have enough operating theatres. We don't run the public service as a business, which we should do. right? So in other words, if you can't get into the theatres, if there isn't enough nurses or they're closed down in Beaumont, you have to get out. And if you don't do a certain number of surgical procedures, if you're a surgeon, for example, per year, you will not stay on the register. So you don't, in a lot of cases, you don't have any option except to, sorry, in see you in the Hermitage Clinic or Blackrock or wherever. That's the reality. And you get all these politicians talking, and they haven't got a bull's notion what they're talking about. But that's part of the course. The public like bullshit in Ireland. They love it. So you can tell them like, oh, he was terrific. He represented, he didn't quite get over to here, but he bloody nearly did. He represented a hell of a lot of people in the north, so they thought he was great. That's life, isn't it?
Right. We'll get...
Sorry for all of that rant.
No, but it's... yeah, we know we've a good idea of what Ireland is like. What we're now wondering about is what Germany is like, Dr. Werner. What's the situation in Germany with regards to this and to the health service in general?
Yes, I start from the beginning, and we began in April, 15 April, to look at the situation in Germany. And as doctors, we felt that something goes wrong, because there was a difference between making panic in the media and the numbers of infected people and dying people. There was a big difference. And therefore, we started to look at the situation, and we made a lot of inquiry. And we then found an article of Glenn Novak, PR director of the CDC, the Center of Disease Control, from 29, how to sell vaccines. And he gave a 7-step plan. And this 7-step plan is like what happened nowadays in March and April. And he proposed for selling vaccines for making a lot of demand on the vaccines. He told that you must have fear in the people, and to make fear and of the people, and you must tell that there is a killer virus. You understand, killer virus in the people, and so a lot of fear among the people started, and we saw that there was nearly no scientific base for all the treatment and all the doings of the government. And we had the first lockdown in Germany in April, and this lockdown was without any effect. And nevertheless, we have now a second lockdown without any effect, and we got this masquerade in the people without any effects. And we collected 50 studies about the face mask, and no one study said that the masks have any effects fighting against the virus and so on. Nevertheless, the government decided that everybody must wear a mask, and since 2012, they changed the laws in the so-called infection laws. So nowadays, when there is a pandemia, a so-called pandemia, the government can do what the government wants, and there we have nearly no laws in Germany, and we are fighting against this situation by enlightening the people about what happens here. So, the so-called PCR, who is an anchor point, an anchor thing for the government, is medical meaningless. The PCR is meaningless to detect infections, and so you have only positive tests, and you have no infection, no. You cannot say whether we have an infection or not, but we have positive tests, and you can do a never-ending pandemia by testing the people. Now in Germany, about 25 million people are tested, and if you only take the false positive tests, you have all the time a pandemia, and we are a little bit disappointed that the doctors, the medical doctors, say not enough that this pandemia, who is called by the government, is a fake pandemia, because they in 29 they altered the criteria for the having a pandemia, and so you can say to every flu, we now have a pandemia. You must. Coronavirus is a cold virus, and if you have in Germany 50 infections per 100,000 people, you must see this. Only 50 people, 50 men or women have a cold, then you can call it a pandemia. It's
Dr. Weber, so you're part of a group of doctors that are opposed to, called, what's the name of it? Ärzte für auf, yeah.
Doctors for Enlightenment.
So in Germany, in Ireland, as Professor Tormey was saying here, we have the government and we have an advisory body set up by the health authorities called NEFIT. We won't go into the real name, like SAGE in England. Is it the same situation in Germany, where there's a group of people who are kind of dominating the agenda when it comes to the German government, that the politicians are just, how would you put it, Bill?
Lapdogs
Lapdogs.
to the medical establishment.
That the politicians are lapdogs to
the one. Yeah,
we have only very few people who are telling the government what is right. We have no advisory board of enough scientific people who are discussing about the situation. We have only 2 or 3 or 5 people who are telling what is true. What is the so-called truth, and we detected a lot of mistakes they made, and every adverse every adverse addiction is suppressed in Germany. Our YouTube channel is suppressed.
Right.
Our konto on the bank, our number on the bank is suppressed, and the government is doing her work. Totalitarian.
It's a totalitarian regime, are you saying?
Yes. In Germany, we have a totalitarian regime. We have dictator nowadays.
What the latest health regulations or the latest health bill? What exactly did they? What did they consist of? The most recent health regulations.
We have now no regulation. The regulation in a democracy, is by the parliament,
Right.
is by the justice, and the justice is sleeping, and the parliament is sleeping, and only the executive is working here and is doing what they want.
Right. Okay, Bill, you want to?
Lindy,
The situation in Germany is, from the outside, it's not bad, but in the inside, we have now a dictatorial system.
And there are protests, though, aren't there?
Yes, we go on the streets. We have a lot of protests, but the protest is they made it difficult to have a protest because they say we have a pandemia and you must have your distance.
Right. Okay.
And so if we try to have 1,000 or 10,000 people on the street, there's not enough place. And then they say nobody has his, not all the people has his mask. The distance is not right, so we finish the demonstration.
And are the police? Have there been any cases of? Like we've seen the police in France, for instance, and in Britain, definitely overreacting. Has there
The
been
police
that
is the police is very different. In some cities, the police is very polite. We had in Leipzig a demonstration with about, I think, 500,000 people.
Wow.
And the police was very polite. In Berlin, we had about 50,000 people, and they had water spreading machines. You know what I mean, Wasserwerfer.
cannons.
I don't know it in English.
Water cannons.
And
Yeah.
they destroyed the demonstration by this. In Berlin, the police was not polite.
Yeah, well, there are two issues that I think Dr. Weber is dealing with. The first issue is the last one, really, the right of citizens in a democracy to protest at a government policy. And that has been seriously undermined in most EU countries. And I, as a civil libertarian, disagree with that entirely. I remember getting a kick in my ass in 1969, I think, for sitting down on O'Connell Bridge in Dublin as part of the support of the Dublin Housing Action Committee when we were in pre-med, if you don't mind. And I still remember that. A big cop gave me a kick in the backside, on O'Connell Bridge, which, ouch. But anyway, Lindy, the point you're making there, Professor Weber, is absolutely right about protests. However, if you're talking about public health, you then have to get the figures. And the figures are very important. For example, the published figures in respectable peer-reviewed journals show hugely divergent risks of death from this particular virus. To pretend that this virus is benign gainsays the facts, and the facts are in the UK over 40,000 people have died. probably from COVID.
But, with COVID.
Hold on.
Yeah,
Probably
go on.
from COVID.
Probably,
In the hospital I'm in, hold on.
probably
In the hospital I'm
in,
in, there is
in
no
this
doubt.
period.
I wrote a paper on what we should be doing for chemistry for people in ICU at the very beginning of all of this. And in the hospital I'm in, about between 11 and 14% of the people who are in ICU with COVID, undisputed COVID, died. So this is not the same as a winter virus.
But what age were they?
Hold on.
Yeah,
The next
sorry.
point is, if you look at the data, then it doesn't matter what age they are, they have a right to life, right? There were also ethical discussions held behind closed doors as to who to save in the apocalyptic situation where there were a crowd of people who should be admitted and they weren't being admitted. And that was really never really published. There's a whole lot of stuff that the government was really you're right about that, Dr. Weber. In Ireland, the government was very successful in scaring the living God out of the population, that this thing was an apocalypse and it was really dangerous. I think the most interesting thing is looking at the Spanish data published a few weeks ago are in the British Medical Journal, the 12th of the 8th. It was about the fatality rates in Spain. And they found in a huge community study of 2.3 million infected individuals, which is a fair few, there were 19,228. 0.8% were fatal. This is the Spanish stuff.
Right.
And the bottom line is that the fatality rate was high. The fatality rate increased sharply over the age of 50. It went from 8.1 to 16, in the range 8.1 to 16.5%. And it was worse in men. And then when you got to over 80, it was really bad. And what seems to have happened is that it precipitated death in a whole lot of people who were just about hanging on by their fingertips. The evidence for that is that the Central Statistics Office deaths from July, August were down, were under trend. So that means that the people who would have died in August or whatever died earlier. That's really what it means. In relation to the overreach of lockdowns and everything else, I think there is an overreach, but I think it would be a bit fallacious and wild to ignore the risk to people over the age of 60. I think that's serious. So I think that they have made a mess of this. The risk under the age of 10 is negligible. It's hardly been reported that under 10s have actually infected anybody else. Keeping colleges closed and schools closed seems to me to be headless chicken stuff. And it's part of the frightening of the life of the whole population. And, that's what's going on. But I think that it is quite clear that any respiratory virus, of which this coronavirus, COVID-19, is undoubtedly a respiratory virus, fundamentally, that has a huge effect on the immune system's knockout part of it, and also affects the coagulation system.
Pardon, I don't agree
Well,
with
I
you.
don't mind whether you agree or not. It's been shown that, in fact, it does affect the coagulation system, and it does rev up because all the markers in the blood, I've seen it myself, patients that I've seen myself, so I don't go in for other people's opinions on this. It's just, I've seen it. I've just seen it. So what I'm trying to say to you is that actually this thing is really serious for people over the age of 60. So you could actually, or over the age of 50 if you want to gild the lily like they do here. And for people underneath that, it's not that bad because it's not going to kill you. The problem is, to what extent do people who get this disease have a tail? In other words, are they chronically ill with a whole lot of things hanging out? And is this any different from some of the big flu epidemics that happened 10 or 15 years ago, where you had ME and all these sort of general flop syndromes that came after post-viral fatigue syndromes and all this kind of stuff. And the trouble about medicine is that people get old and move on, and the next generation hasn't seen what we've seen, so they forget and they reinvent the wheel all the time. So reinventing the wheel is part of all of this, and scaremongering at the same time. But I think that I disagree with you in relation to virus vaccines. I think that there are two things the vaccines that are coming up, there's 2 points. There's mRNA vaccine, of which there are 2, Moderna and the Pfizer one. And the problem with the Pfizer one is the -80. And then there's the Moderna one, and there's a whole lot of vaccines to do with adenovirus, colds, live viral vaccines changed. And the question really will be, what will be the side effects of all of these? And given the economic disasters that this thing is actually foisting on the population, and for those of us like me who are old enough to remember mass emigration from Ireland, which is horrendous with unemployment. You saw that, Lindy? I saw it, okay? And the bottom line is that we don't want that again. So if the vaccination system is actually going to take an awful lot of this down, good. The difficulty is, how well are we going to monitor what's happening? Because I think that there is a risk that if you put in this say spike protein into somebody, is what they're doing, and there's a massive immune response, you'll have a kind of a pseudo COVID happen, people.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit concerned about that. But I've seen
It
some
is
of the
an
stuff on the
infiltrate-
internet,
it
and
is
the
an
mad
infiltrate-
anti-vaxxers, you know, should be taken on.
Well, right. So, Doctor, what's happening in Germany?
It's a lot of themes, it's a lot of issues, and I can only speak for Germany.
Yeah.
In Germany, this virus is not as dangerous as a flu just 2 years ago. And in Germany, less people are dying from this virus. This is a fact in Germany. I don't know all the other countries. And you are speaking about vaccination. I now speak about immune system. We don't have any discussion, any public discussion about the immune system. And we can treat this virus nearly 100% without any vaccinations by a lot of stuff, e.g. high doses vitamin C, e.g. chlordioxine, e.g. chloroquine.
Can I actually move on to something on a slightly different angle? I think the theme of what we really want to discuss here this evening is the power of governments to force the population to do things relating to their own health, which I personally regard as micromanagement, to be honest. I think that they're just telling us to do too much. This is in Germany. Are the government saying that vaccinations will be mandatory, and are tests mandatory if, say, for instance, you want to go into a hospital?
In Germany, in April, the Chancellor Merkel said this so-called pandemic is ended only by vaccinations. Okay. This is an expression which is scientifically false, because a pandemic ends when the virus ends, yes, and not when the government says we give you a vaccination. And I think it's this is the false way to treat this virus, only by vaccination, but we have a lot of medicaments, but the government only tells us to have these vaccinations, and they are in a very hurry to do these vaccinations, and the side effects are not discovered, and so on and so on. And the vaccination, which is now coming, will be very dangerous for all the people, and normally a vaccine or medicament takes 5 to 10 years to come, and now we have a vaccination within 1 year. This is very dangerous for the people.
So,
And the government is saying us to do this. And if you are not vaccinated, you cannot do this or that.
okay, that's what I wanted to know. If what's concerning me here is just the erosion of of citizens' rights to look after their own health in their own way,
Yes,
and whether, for instance, you're going to get fined lots of money. I don't know. In Ireland, they've been threatening fines on you if you don't wear a mask on a bus. I think something like that, and something else that I can't remember.
They were fining people for leaving their house more than 55 kilometres.
Or were they?
Yeah,
Really?
I did this. The laws are just ridiculous.
So are they?
But I'm not elected, so.
If you is it possible to refuse to take the vaccine in Germany? Is really what I'm saying.
yes, of course. Yes, you can refuse, but then
The European courts would not allow mandatory vaccine.
you cannot go into the theater. You cannot go into an airplane. You cannot do this and that. If you have no vaccination, you must stay at home.
Okay. So we're kind of slightly
So,
running out of time. I'd just like to ask one simple question of both of you. Fast forward to this time next year. Where, Dr. Weber, where do you predict that Germany will be in terms of the coronavirus in, say, a year's time or even 6 months' time? What's the future holding?
I hope we can tell the people that the vaccination is not the only way of handling this virus. You can treat all the people. You can treat when the people has symptoms and when they get ill, and nearly you can treat about 100%, and you don't need any vaccination. We hope to tell the people, but the power of the pharmacy is very, very big, or very great. So there is a fight between those both ways of handling our health, doing by ourselves or to get a vaccination, to do all things. And for me, this is a form of slavery.
Do you think, though, my general view from reading history, which is more my specialised area, is that vaccines just die out? I mean, do you think that the vaccine may have died out by next year, the end of next year? The virus, sorry. The vaccine, sorry, what am I saying? That the virus will have died out by the end of next year.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. If every year we have a new form of virus,
Yeah.
every year. The next year we have the next virus, COVID-21 and 22, COVID-22 and COVID-23. Every year the virus changes, and by this plan, you need every year a vaccination at a time when the immunity of the people is enough. You need, about 60% immunity in the people,
Yes.
so that the virus will die. And every year we reach is, and the next year comes a new virus, and we don't need any vaccination.
What do you think, Bill?
Well, to answer your original question, I think that it would be foolhardy not to vaccinate the population, really stupid in the current context. I think that what's happening at the moment is that the coronavirus is mutating all the time, and there are hundreds of different fingerprints in the coronaviruses right now. How pathological each of them is unknown at this stage. By a year, the government made a mistake here. They didn't call what they wanted to do. If you want to eliminate the virus, there's two ways. You can only do it by keeping it out or by getting herd immunity. Dr. Weber is actually right about herd immunity at 60%. It's actually about 75%. And it has been shown in polio, whooping cough, and a whole lot of other things that we've been trying to get rid of, in smallpox, etc., that actually getting rid of things does work. There's no doubt about it that if you look at the 1919 pandemic flu, that was much more lethal than this. So the 20 million or something like that, and you see wild figures, within 5 to 10 million people just added in or subtracted in relation to the number of deaths for that. So this is not the same as the 1919 flu. It's also not true to say you can treat all of these people. I saw people from minority groups, including Romas, etc., die. Whole families die from this because their immune system is different. Oh. And it seems that if you're African origin or South Asian origin, that you have a much higher death rate than a Caucasian from this current coronavirus.
Even Asian people living here.
Because,
because the rate in the countries near China.
No, it's not that. It's
lower.
Just the death rate is higher in these people, ex aequo from all sorts of things. There are various things now that weren't available. There's anti-IL-6, anti-IL-10. And the other thing is that vitamin D deficiency seems to make it more lethal, if you want to put it like that. So there is a question. Instead of threatening everybody, you should all tell them to take some vitamin D. Thank you very much. Would be a good idea for the population, the younger ones in particular.
And get out and do some exercise.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the point is that we have all of this, and there's no doubt that the infectivity of this, fortunately, it just causes people to be ill when they're under 50, by and large. Yeah. You're very unlucky, whatever is the difference in your immune system. If you die from this, you're very unlucky. But there is a mortality associated with ordinary flu every year. And Professor Weber, in this country, Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, we give a flu vaccine to virtually all adults every winter, because the flu vaccine changes, as you know very well. So I think that we're going to have a coronavirus vaccine chucked into the flu vaccine as a routine from now on in.
Well, I suspect the same, and I won't be taking it.
Well, I mean, yeah, but you'll have a choice, but that's what I think will happen.
Right. Well, that's an interesting discussion of various viewpoints, which is exactly what we want on this programme. Don't forget that this debate is produced for you by a small band of volunteers, mostly from Health Freedom Ireland and the Irish Inquiry. We'd like to thank our little team today, which is Stephen and Sarah, Danny looking after the cameras, who's freezing cold over there, and Stephen for checking the sound and seemingly making it better every single week. If you're able to support us financially, we'd greatly appreciate it, because obviously the lights, the cameras and everything costs money. And there's a donation page on the Irish Inquiry website. I'll finish up with one thing, which is, if you're looking for information on Corona-19, if you're looking for news and a roundup of that, I found a website today called collateralglobal.org, set up by a group of eminent scientists of varying views. And it's an extremely good roundup of news from all over the world, not just on Corona, I have to say. There's some interesting stuff about addiction, about psychiatric problems that are being experienced. Somebody asked me recently whether the rate of murders had gone up, a question I couldn't answer, but...
The rate of them beating up partners has gone up, I can tell you that for free.
So, but there is a confusing amount of information there, but I must say I found this website pretty good, and as I say, it's called collateralglobal.org, and there's also a very good roundup of information compiled by a group of Swiss doctors, which I'd recommend. So we'll leave it at there. We will thank our two eminent doctors, Dr. Weber in Germany, thank you very much, and Bill Tormey, who's an old buddy of mine from my college days, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you.